When we feel attacked, we have to decide if we will embrace the battle or decide it's not worth it. In small ways, we have to decide if it's the right fight. Last week we started a series for Lent called Waging Peace, Learning How to Fight Like Jesus through the Gospel of Luke. And last week Ashlyn talked about fighting temptation. And if you haven't picked up on it, this week is about fighting the right fight. So even better than Kennedy, we will learn from Jesus today. And Brandy, if you want to come on up. Bambi. From Wichita, right?
Looks like a Brandy.
It's a good thing I wrote this out. Who knows what I was saying?
Thank you.
She's going to read from. Yes. You have that paper. Oh, here it is. Thank you for your prayers.
Okay, Luke 4:14 through 30. Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit, and news about him spread through the whole countryside. He was teaching in their synagogues, and everyone praised him. He went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened upon him. He began by saying to them, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his lips. "Isn't this Joseph's son?" they asked. Jesus said to them, "Surely you will quote this proverb to me, 'Physician, heal yourself,' and you will tell me, 'Do here in your hometown what we have heard that you did in Capernaum.' Truly I tell you," he continued, "no prophet is accepted in his hometown. I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time, when the sky was shut for 3.5 years, and there was a severe famine throughout the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to a widow in Zarephath, in the region of Sidon? Yep. And there were many in Israel with leprosy in the time of Elisha the prophet, yet not one of them was cleansed, only Naaman and Syrian. All the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this. They got up, drove him out of the town, and took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built, in order to throw him off the cliff. But he walked right through the crowd and went on his way. God is still speaking.
Thanks be to God.
Thank you, baby. When I moved back to Ohio from Oregon, in 2015, I was looking for work as I finished seminary, and I got a job at a local public library. I'm a big believer in public libraries, and it was a fun job, and very much a ministry, by the way. But I had a dear coworker, it's kind of a grandmother type woman, who was obsessed with family names and connections in the county. So anytime a new person would walk into the library, she would just keep asking them questions. Are you related to so-and-so? What about so-and-so? They have this name. And it's like she couldn't rest until she had that slot in her brain. Like, okay, they're a Brown, so they must be like this. They have this personality and this character. And they're trustworthy or not. And I experienced this a lot because it was where I grew up and my parents are from. And so they would say, "Oh, you're Don and Sandy's son, so you must be one of the good ones," before they, had really even gotten to know me as an adult. So it worked out fine for me, but God helped the person who had a name with a bad reputation. This is not a new phenomenon. We see it in this story, where Jesus returns to his hometown of Nazareth and gets to preach in the synagogue. And they are initially very excited about their hometown boy and his graceful sermon. And they said, "Oh, isn't this Joseph's son? We know Joseph. Good man, hard worker. Didn't necessarily expect such a well-spoken son, but good for him." Then Jesus starts going on about Elisha and widows and droughts and lepers, and a little strange, a little too social justice for all, a little too critical of his own people. In essence, they repeat their question, but with a very different tone. "Isn't that Joseph's son? Who does he think he is to come in here and talk about us like that, and to talk about himself like that?" It's interesting that the story happens immediately after the wilderness temptations that we talked about last week. The rejection story follows the temptation story. In both cases, they're challenging Jesus' identity. Satan said in the wilderness, "If you are the Son of God, prove it." His hometown folks were saying, "Aren't you Joseph's son?" Now, he was the son of Joseph, but he was also more than that. He was the son of Joseph and son of God. Jesus of Nazareth, but Jesus, son of God. And we too have many identities and relationships, and sometimes these will be used to label and limit us. And we have to decide who we will let name us. Who will you let name you? Jesus had to say, yes, I have these family, vocational, and regional identities, but the very core of who I am is defined by the voice that I heard at my baptism. And God said, "This is my Son, the beloved, in whom I am well pleased." And as followers of Jesus, we claim that same voice, that same naming of God. We're a beloved son or daughter, and God delights in us. Before anything else, that is who we are. And so fighting the right fight begins with knowing who and whose we are. Who and whose we are. What does that have to do with conflict? Well, if you don't find security in God's love, we will go chasing it everywhere else, and we will go demanding it everywhere else. And conflict and chaos will surround us because we will walk around angry, but no one is meeting our needs. Always needing to defend our reputation. Always fighting to prove ourselves. But if we wage peace in the world, we have to make peace inside ourselves with who and whose we are. We have the freedom to say two words. Let them. I recently heard an interview with an author named Mel Robbins who wrote a book called The Let Them Theory. She talks about the peace and freedom that we find when we let go of the need to control everyone else. And she said this: let them judge, let them react, let them doubt, let them question the decisions you're making, let them be wrong about you, let them roll their eyes. Instead of wasting your time worrying about them, start living your life in a way that makes you proud of yourself. Let me do what I want to do with my one wild and precious life. She also says we should stop trying to please everyone and ask if our Creator is pleased with us. If yes, we keep going. If no, we stop. Now listen, none of this is easy for me. I'm a chronic people pleaser and peacekeeper. If there's conflict anywhere, or it seems like somebody doesn't like me, I feel it in my body, and it feels like I need to quickly fix it. I'm saying some not. Maybe I'm not the only one. But I'm learning to let them. I'm learning to let God name me and stand inside of who and whose I am. For the rest of it, I lean on the serenity prayer, right? If you're familiar with that. If we aren't self-aware, we easily rush into battle thinking we are fighting the good fight for a just cause, when the reality is it may be just about our ego or our insecurity. So secondly, fighting the right fight means choosing our battles wisely. Choosing our battles wisely. You may have heard the saying, you don't have to show up to every argument you're invited to. You don't have to show up to every argument you're invited into. Well, Jesus was invited to a pretty big fight in this story. It says that the people were furious. Now, the Greek word used there was the same word that's used for a violent storm. And violence did break out. They were ready to push him off the edge of a cliff. Pretty intense conflict. Hope you've never been in that situation. It says the people were furious, and that Greek word is this, it says they drove him out of town, and that Greek word was the same one used to talk about casting out devils. So they labeled him, demonized him, and invited him to fight. And who could have blamed Jesus if he did fight back? Maybe using his spiritual powers, put them all in their place. But at some point, it seems like Jesus made a decision. He decided this was not the time, nor the place, nor the people. It was not the right fight. Essentially, he decided, not today, Satan. Remember this, a true fight, as opposed to an emotional outburst or a fit of rage, a true fight is an act of respect. Now, that may seem counterintuitive at first, but think about this. Fights require that we expend energy. It takes energy to risk a confrontation, think through the right words, listen to somebody else, respond. If it doesn't go well, you spend all your time reflecting back on it, or figuring out how to reconcile. It's no wonder that many of us settle for fake fights. I was thinking of the WWE, or back in my day it was WWF. Very fake fighting. Instead of metal chairs, though, we use good old-fashioned passive aggression, or pacifist aggression for some of us, or talking behind people's backs, or taking that out on the poor dog or stranger on the internet. Because fighting right requires energy, we should save our fights for people who we truly love and respect. The only quarrels that really move things forward are lovers' quarrels, or sparring between worthy opponents with some level of mutual respect or common concern. Interestingly, some scholars recently have pointed out that, all those nasty stories about Jesus and the Pharisees, we may have been reading them wrong, or at least incomplete. When you read the Gospels, Jesus seems to reserve his strongest words for the Pharisees. They seem to be his enemies. Indeed, he did have very harsh criticisms for them. But they pointed out that in some ways, this was because he had more in common with them than he had with others. If he hated them, he wouldn't have bothered. Instead, he engaged them in a practice common among the rabbis called argument for the sake of heaven. Argument for the sake of heaven. I won't try to pronounce the Hebrew for that. But the rabbis engaged in these spirited debates so that in the creative tension, the iron sharpens iron, and they might get closer to truth or justice or holiness. The important thing for them was to make sure you're arguing for the sake of heaven instead of for the sake of victory, which is typically our go-to. So we also ask, will this argument move us closer to truth or understanding or justice? Am I arguing with someone I respect or share common concern with? The right fight usually involves the right people at the right place at the right time. And if these are not lining up, maybe you should save your strength. Don't waste your breath. Bite your tongue. Punch a pillow. Scroll on past. And live to fight another day. Remember what Jesus taught the disciples to do when he sent them out to the surrounding villages. He said, when you go into a new place, give them your peace. And if they don't accept it, take back your peace and do what? Does anybody remember?
Dust your shoes off.
Yeah, dust your shoes off. Shake the dust off your feet. And we actually did that, remember, physically together, because it's actually called somatic shaking. It's a therapeutic exercise. A less spiritual way to put it is, not my circus, not my monkeys. I like the strategy that Abraham Lincoln used called hot letters. When he felt the urge to really tell someone off, he would get it all out by writing a really angry letter. And after it was all done, and he had cooled off, he would write on it, never sent, never signed. Never sent, never signed. There's a picture of one that he wrote to a general in the Union Army who he blamed for Gettysburg. And he decided not to send it. Never sent, never signed. Thirdly, fighting the right fight means walking in step with the Spirit. In step with the Spirit. Learning to walk in step with the Spirit means we accept that the Spirit could lead us to move toward conflict or away from conflict. In the coming weeks, we'll be talking more about Jesus moving toward conflict as he went into Jerusalem. But today we're dwelling and lingering with the fact that sometimes Jesus moved away from conflict. He didn't do it passively, he did it purposefully. And I love the last verse of that story. But he walked right through the crowd and went on his way. He didn't argue, he didn't beg, he didn't try to please or pacify or fix it. He didn't run either, he just walked right through the crowd and went on his way. He did the let them thing because he had other places to be, other places where his peace would be welcomed, other people worthy of his energy, other places aligned with his purpose. Sometimes following Jesus means walking away. It's easier to walk away, though, when we know what we're walking toward. We talked about identity, and part of that is purpose. Having a sense of purpose enables us to walk away when it's not the right fight. In his book, When to Walk Away, Finding Freedom from Toxic People, Gary Thomas writes, and sometimes to follow in the footsteps of Jesus is to walk away from others or to let them walk away from us. Now I need to pause here because there's a lot of misunderstanding about this idea. There have been a lot of really bad teachings about this that have created confusion. So I want to spend a moment to say that sometimes following Jesus means walking away, and that includes relationships, and churches. If a church or a church leader teaches toxic theology that dehumanizes you or the people you love, that teaches an abusive God, it may be in step to walk with the Spirit right out of that church and find another spiritual community, hopefully. I'm not talking about church hopping or finding a more, with a better music and preaching. I'm talking about maintaining your integrity and your safety. Safety is a perfectly legitimate reason to leave an abusive household or relationship. That sounds like common sense, but it's not always, unfortunately. God does not demand you suffer to save someone else. Be loosed from that. If you are in danger or your soul is being harmed, it may be that you are called to follow the Spirit out that door and stay with a good friend or shelter or talk to law enforcement. Now, didn't Jesus tell us to love our enemies? Didn't Jesus sacrifice his life? Yes, absolutely, to both. But when we read the Gospels closely, we see Jesus purposefully avoided danger many times. Today's reading is an example of that. If you need another one, look up John 11. Eventually, Jesus did choose to walk toward the conflict and toward his death. When the fight was right and the time was right, he set his face to Jerusalem and carried his cross. He said, "No one takes my life from me. I lay it down of my own accord." Until then, he left Nazareth. He avoided Jerusalem. He defended a woman caught in adultery whose life was in danger. He affirmed dignity in life and released healing everywhere he could. Sometimes we walk away from the fight for our own safety, and sometimes we walk away from the fight for the sake of strategy. You are surely familiar with the military term of retreat. But maybe you don't know that there's a cooler term that is used nowadays about retreat. It's called strategic withdrawal or tactical withdrawal. Intelligence, that's right. Sometimes we withdraw from the wrong fight so we can be ready for the right one. We leave the battlefield to rest, heal, and come up with a new plan. This is used in nonviolent social movements as well. If you want to go to the next one, Ashlyn. Last week, Ashlyn talked about the civil rights marchers crossing the now infamous Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. Interestingly, named after a grand wizard of the KKK. In that case, the civil rights marchers moved toward the conflict, right into the hands of a brutal police force. In an event that became known as Bloody Sunday, the world saw images of peaceful protesters beaten with billy clubs and whips and tear gas. As people watched it on TV, their consciences were pricked and their hearts were open to the movement. What you may not know is that 2 days later, Dr. King and the other organizers planned another march. By that time, around 2,000 people had come. King had put out a call for clergy from all around the country to join, and others saw it on the news and came. They were to march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. The marchers came together that day and sang, "Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around." And they started walking and crossed that same infamous bridge. They were able to cross it and were once again met with the Alabama State Troopers, who actually moved away as if to let them pass. This was likely a trick, but they never got to find out, because at that point, King called upon everyone to kneel and pray. Some of the clergy led the group in prayer, and they sang a song, and King directed everyone to go back. Most of the marchers were shocked. Many had come ready to sacrifice whatever it took for the cause of justice and equality and go all the way to the state capitol. Many of the organizers didn't know this, and they were outraged. How could King be so weak and timid, especially when the world was watching? What had actually happened was that a judge had ordered an injunction against demonstrations in a portion of the city. This judge was sympathetic to the civil rights movement, so they believed he would lift the injunction after he had the required hearings. Furthermore, a representative of President Johnson met with King and a few others the night before, trying to convince them to wait. King did not think that people would wait even if he asked them to. So they formed a plan to take a symbolic march across the bridge, using a route that wouldn't violate federal law. Then they would turn around and go home or to church until the injunction was lifted. President Johnson was about to introduce the Voting Rights Bill, and King believed cooperation with the administration to pass that bill that addressed many of the concerns they were marching about was more important than a success on that particular day. Besides that, he wanted to avoid more bloodshed, because even if the troopers didn't attack them, without protection, they would face violence in the secluded parts of their march across Alabama. It was a strategic or tactical withdrawal. King was heavily criticized for this action, but it worked. Less than a week later, LBJ introduced the bill to Congress, demanding that they pass it. In a historic speech, he called Selma a turning point in man's unending search for freedom. MLK sent a telegram to LBJ to congratulate him on the speech, calling it the most moving, eloquent, unequivocal, passionate plea for human rights ever made by any president of this nation. Pretty high compliment. A week later, the federal judge ruled in favor of the protesters. And yet another week later, the third and final march began, gathering thousands more as they went. This time, they were protected by both Alabama State Troopers and 2,000 soldiers from the U.S. Army. The march lasted 5 days as they traveled along Jefferson Davis Highway until they reached the state capitol, and King gave his famous "How long, not long" speech. Dr. King believed that those who seek peace must organize as effectively as those who organize for war. He was a man among many other folks who sought to wage peace in an expression of his faith and in a lover's quarrel with his country. Constantly surrounded by conflict, Dr. King did his best to keep in step with the Spirit. In fact, the Rabbi Abraham Heschel, who marched in the movement, commented once, "When I marched, I felt like my legs were praying." Sometimes our steps lead us toward conflict, sometimes away from conflict. But if we're seeking to follow the Spirit and fighting only the right fights, our feet will enact a sort of prayer. In that spirit, let's enter a few minutes of open, waiting worship. I've got a couple queries or questions for you to consider. We'll take a time of quiet reflection, but please, if something rises that you would like to share for the community, please do so. Please stand and share. And these two queries to consider are, who are you allowing to name you besides God? And how is the Spirit or the voice of wisdom calling you to move toward or away from Him? Let's listen and share together.